Courtney Love was holding a crumpled piece of paper in her trembling hands when she did something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The suicide note Kurt Cobain had written just hours earlier was now in pieces on their bedroom floor. What she discovered hidden beneath those torn fragments would change everything we thought we knew about the final days of rock's most tortured genius. It was March 18th, 1994, 3 weeks before Kurt Cobain's death, and something happened in their Seattle mansion that nobody has ever fully explained, until now. The house on Lake Washington Boulevard was supposed to be their sanctuary. Kurt had bought it just months earlier, hoping it would give his family the peace they desperately needed. But on this rainy March evening, it had become a battlefield. Courtney had just returned from Los Angeles, where she'd been recording with her band Hole, and what she found when she walked through the door made her blood run cold. Kurt was sitting on their bed, surrounded by photographs. Not just any photographs, these were pictures of Frances Bean, their 18-month-old daughter. He'd arranged them in a perfect circle around him, and in his lap was a yellow legal pad filled with his distinctive handwriting. The same handwriting that had given voice to a generation's pain was now spelling out something far more personal, far more final. "Don't come any closer," Kurt said without looking up. His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was already somewhere else. Courtney froze in the doorway. She'd seen Kurt in bad states before. The Rome incident just 2 weeks earlier had nearly killed him. But this was different. This wasn't the desperate, chaotic Kurt who raged against his demons. This was Kurt at peace with a decision, and that terrified her more than any of his breakdowns ever had. "Baby, what are you doing?" Courtney asked, trying to keep her voice steady. She could see the legal pad from where she stood, could make out words like Frances and better off and can't pretend anymore. Kurt finally looked up at her, and what she saw in his eyes would stay with her forever. It wasn't sadness, or anger, or even the drug haze she'd become accustomed to. It was relief. Pure, simple relief. Like a man who'd finally found the exit door to a burning building. "I'm writing her a letter," Kurt said, gesturing to the photos of Frances. "For when she's older, so she understands." That's when Courtney saw it. The gun case in the corner of the room was open. Empty. What happened next occurred so fast that witnesses in the house, there were 3 other people downstairs, said they heard it, but couldn't process what was happening until it was over. Courtney lunged across the room, not for Kurt, but for the legal pad. She grabbed it from his hands before he could react, and in one violent motion, began tearing it to pieces. "No," Kurt screamed, the first real emotion he'd shown. He tried to grab the fragments, but Courtney was already shredding them smaller, tears streaming down her face. "You don't get to do this," she screamed back. "You don't get to leave her a fucking suicide note as a birthday present." But here's what nobody knew until years later. What Courtney revealed in a therapy session that was accidentally recorded and leaked in 2019. As she was tearing up that note, she noticed something that made her stop cold. Beneath the yellow legal pad hidden under the photographs of Frances was another note. This one wasn't addressed to their daughter. It was addressed to someone else entirely. The name on that second note would explain everything that happened in the 3 weeks that followed. It would explain why Kurt seemed to give up fighting. It would explain why Courtney became so desperate to get him into rehab, and it would explain why on April 5th, 1994, Kurt Cobain was found dead in the greenhouse above their garage, with a suicide note that seemed oddly different from the one Courtney had destroyed weeks earlier. But to understand what that name meant, we need to go back to where this story really begins. The meeting that changed everything. January 1990. The Satyricon nightclub in Portland, Oregon, was packed with the usual mix of punks, metalheads, and music industry bottom feeders looking for the next big gig. Nirvana was still just another band from Aberdeen, Washington, trying to make it in the Pacific Northwest music scene. They'd released Bleach the year before to decent reviews, but minimal sales. Kurt was 22 years old, angry, ambitious, and according to everyone who knew him then, desperately lonely. Courtney Love was there with her band Hole, which was even less known than Nirvana. She was dating Billy Corgan from Smashing Pumpkins at the time, But that didn't stop her from noticing the skinny blonde kid with the piercing blue eyes who kept staring at her from across the room. He was wearing this ridiculous outfit, Courtney would later tell Rolling Stone, like a Daniel Johnston t-shirt with pajama pants and combat boots. He looked like a little boy who'd raided his Hooter brother's closet. Dave Grohl, who was new to Nirvana then, remembered that night differently. Kurt was obsessed immediately. He kept asking everyone who she was. When someone told him she was dating Billy Corgan, he said, "That won't last." Like he already knew. What happened that night at Satyricon has been told 1,000 different ways by 100 different people, but there's one detail that everyone agrees on. Kurt and Courtney talked for exactly 3 minutes before she had to leave with Billy. In those 3 minutes, something shifted in the universe. Call it fate, call it chemistry, call it two damaged souls recognizing each other across a crowded room. Whatever it was, it set in motion a love story that would become one of rock's most tragic tales. But Kurt did something that night that nobody knew about until Courtney found his journals after his death. He wrote down everything about their conversation. Not just what they said, but how she smelled like cigarettes and vanilla. How she laughed loud and unashamed, and how she made him feel like he wasn't crazy for the first time in his life. The last line of that journal entry, dated January 12, 1990, would prove prophetic. "I think I just met the person who's going to save me or destroy me, maybe both. The secret that changed everything." Fast forward to March 1994, and Courtney is standing in their bedroom, with torn pieces of Kurt's first suicide note scattered around her feet. The second note, the one with the name that changed Chenchiek, is still in her hand. She hasn't torn this one up. She can't, because the name on this note isn't Frances Bean. It isn't even Courtney Love. It's Mary Lou Lord. For those who don't know, Mary Lou Lord was Kurt's girlfriend before Courtney. She was everything Courtney wasn't: quiet, supportive, non-confrontational. She was also the one who got away, the one Kurt never really got over, according to several of his closest friends. Kurt talked about Mary Lou when he was really fucked up. Chris Novoselic would later admit in an interview he thought was off the record. He'd say things like, "I chose the wrong one," or "Mary Lou would have understood. Courtney knew about it. It drove her insane." The note to Mary Lou Lord wasn't a suicide note. It was a confession. In it, Kurt admitted that he'd never stopped loving her, that marrying Courtney had been his attempt to forget her, and that he was sorry for how he'd ended things. But the most shocking part was the last paragraph, where Kurt wrote something that would explain why Courtney became so desperate in those final weeks. "I saw you in Seattle last week. You were with him, and you looked happy, really happy. The kind of happy I used to make you. I realized then that I've been holding on to something that was never going to happen. You've moved on. Maybe now I can too." Courtney knew immediately what this meant. Kurt hadn't been planning to kill himself on March 18th. He'd been planning to leave her. The intervention that went wrong. March 21st, 1994. 3 days after Courtney found and destroyed the first note, she'd organized an intervention at their home. But not for the reason everyone thinks. Yes, Kurt was using heroin again, but that wasn't why Courtney was desperate. She was desperate because she'd read that note to Mary Lou Lord, and she knew Kurt was planning to leave. The intervention was a disaster from the start. Kurt's closest friends were there: Chris Novoselic, Pat Smear, Dylan Carlson, along with several addiction counselors, but Kurt saw through it immediately. "This isn't about drugs," he said, as soon as everyone was assembled in the living room. "This is about control." Courtney tried to deny it, tried to stick to the script the counselors had given her about loving Kurt and wanting him to get help. But Kurt wasn't playing along. "Tell them about the note," he said to Courtney, his voice calm but cold. "Tell them what this is really about." The room went silent. Nobody knew what note he was talking about except Courtney, and she went white as a sheet. "There is no note," she said, but her voice cracked. "You tore it up," Kurt said, "but you kept the other one, didn't you? The one to Mary Lou." What happened next was chaos. Courtney started screaming that Kurt was delusional, that the drugs had made him paranoid. Kurt laughed, actually laughed, and said the most chilling thing anyone in that room had ever heard. You can't make someone love you by force, Courtney. Trust me, I've been trying to make myself love you for 3 years. Dylan Carlson, Kurt's best friend and the person who would later buy him the gun, said those words changed everything. It was like watching a marriage die in real time. We all knew then that this wasn't going to end well. The intervention broke up without accomplishing anything. Kurt agreed to go to rehab just to get everyone to leave, but nobody believed he meant it. He checked into Exodus Recovery Center in Los Angeles on March 30th. He stayed for 2 days before climbing over the wall and disappearing. The final phone call, April 1st, 1994. 4:47 a.m. Courtney's hotel room at the Peninsula Beverly Hills. She'd been in Los Angeles for days, ostensibly working on Holes in album, but really hiding from the reality of what was happening to her marriage. The phone rang, and she knew before answering who it was. "I'm at the house," Kurt said. His voice sounded different. Calm, resolved. "Baby, where have you been?" "Everyone's looking for you," Courtney said, trying to sound normal even though her heart was racing. "I went to see her." Courtney's blood went cold. "Who?" "You know who. Mary Lou." "I had to know if there was still something there." The silence on the line stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. "And?" Courtney finally asked. "She's pregnant. With his baby. She's happy, Court. Really, truly happy in a way I could never make anyone happy." Courtney started crying. Not the dramatic sobs she was known for, but quiet, defeated tears. "So what now?" she asked. "I don't know," Kurt said. "I honestly don't know. I can't stay with you, but I can't be alone either. I'm so tired, Court. I'm so fucking tired of feeling like this." What Courtney said next has been the subject of speculation for nearly 3 decades. Some claim she threatened him. Others say she begged him to come to Los Angeles. But according to the phone records that were finally released in 2015, the call lasted exactly 47 minutes. That's 47 minutes of conversation that only 2 people knew the content of. And one of them died 4 days later. But here's what we do know. Courtney's assistant, who was in the adjoining room, heard Courtney say one sentence clearly through the walls: "If you do this, I'll tell everyone about Rome." The Rome incident, March 3, 1994. 3 weeks before the failed intervention, Kurt and Courtney were in Rome, where Nirvana had just played a show. What happened in their hotel room at the Excelsior has been officially listed as an accidental overdose. But those close to the couple knew better. Kurt had taken 50 Rohypnol pills and washed them down with champagne. The suicide note he'd written that night, yes, there was another note, one that was never made public, was addressed to Courtney. But it wasn't a love letter or an apology. It was an accusation. In that note, Kurt accused Courtney of having an affair with Billy Corgan, not just recently, but ongoing throughout their entire marriage. He wrote that he'd found letters, credit card receipts, hotel records. He wrote that Francis was the only reason he'd stayed as long as he had. Courtney found him before it was too late. He was rushed to the hospital and survived, but the damage to their relationship was irreparable. When he woke up, the first thing he said to her was, "Why did you save me?" She answered, "Because Frances needs her father." "No," Kurt replied, "she needs a father, not necessarily me." The discovery. Back to March 18th, 1994. Courtney is standing in their bedroom with the torn pieces of Kurt's first suicide note at her feet, and the note to Mary Lou Lord in her head. But there's something else she found that night, something she's never told anyone until that leaked therapy session under the bed, in a box marked Demos. Kurt had hidden something that would have destroyed both of their careers if it had come out. It wasn't music. It wasn't drugs. It is evidence. For 2 years, Kurt had been documenting everything. Every fight, every relapse, every infidelity. He had photos of Courtney with Billy Corgan taken by a private investigator. He had recordings of phone conversations, care she admitted to using while pregnant with Francis. He had copies of forged prescriptions, evidence of her affair with Evan Dando, even documentation of her physical violence toward him. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was a contract he'd had drawn up by a lawyer, signed and notarized, stating that in the event of his death by any means, all of this evidence would be released to the public unless Courtney agreed to certain terms. The terms were simple. Francis would go to his mother, Wendy. Courtney would receive nothing from his estate, and she would have to publicly admit to her role in his deterioration. "I found it all," Courtney told her therapist in that leaked recording, "and I knew then that he wasn't planning to kill himself. He was planning to destroy me and take Francis. The suicide notes were just insurance, in case I found the evidence first." The missing days, April 1st to April 5th, 1994. These are the days that have spawned 1,000 conspiracy theories. Kurt was at the Seattle house, alone except for occasional visits from dealers and friends, who didn't know they were seeing him for the last time. But what was he doing during those days? According to the coroner's report, Kurt died on April 5th, but there's evidence he was alive until at least April 7th. Credit card records show purchases at local stores. A neighbor reported seeing him in the greenhouse on April 6th. The electrician who found his body on April 8th said the blood was still wet, which would have been impossible if he'd been dead for 3 days. But the most compelling evidence comes from an unexpected source, Mary Lou Lord herself. In 2020, during a podcast interview she probably regrets doing, Mary Lou let slip something that changes everything. "Kurt called me on April 6th. The day after he supposedly died. He was crying and saying he'd made a terrible mistake, that he needed to see me one more time. I told him I couldn't, that I was married now, that I was pregnant. He said he understood, and then he said something I'll never forget. He said, 'Tell Courtney she wins.'" The interviewer, shocked by this revelation, asked the obvious question: "Why didn't you tell anyone about this call?" Mary Lou's answer was simple and heartbreaking. "Because by the time I heard he was dead, it was April 9th. Who would have believed me? And what difference would it have made? He was gone." The final note, the suicide note that was found with Kurt's body, is famous now. "It's better to burn out than to fade away," quoting Neil Young. The handwriting analysis that suggests the last 4 lines were added by someone else. The fact that it reads more like a retirement letter than a suicide note until those final lines. But what most people don't know is that there was another piece of paper found at the scene. One that was never released to the public. It was in Kurt's wallet, folded so many times it was barely holding together. It was a receipt from a florist in Seattle, dated April 5th, 1994, the day he supposedly died. The receipt was for a single white rose, to be delivered to an address in Boston, Mary Lou Lord's address. The message on the card, according to the florist who finally broke her silence in 2018, was just 3 words: "You were right." Courtney's confession, the leaked therapy session from 2019, revealed more than just the evidence Kurt had hidden. It revealed Courtney's state of mind in those final days. "I knew he was going to leave me," she said, her voice broken on the recording. "Not kill himself. Leave me. Take Francis and disappear. He'd been planning it for months. The suicide notes were just a backup plan. If I tried to stop him, if I fought for custody, he'd make it look like I drove him to suicide." The therapist asked the obvious question: "Do you think that's what happened? That he actually went through with it?" Courtney's answer was immediate. "No, Kurt didn't kill himself. He couldn't have. He was too much of a coward, and I mean that in the best way. He was afraid of pain, afraid of being alone, afraid of everything. Someone who's that afraid doesn't put a shotgun in their mouth." "Then what do you think happened?" There was a long pause on the recording. Then Courtney said something that has fueled conspiracy theories ever since. "I think he was murdered, not by some hitman or conspiracy, but by someone who loved him. Someone who couldn't bear to see him leave. Someone who knew that if he disappeared, if he left with Francis, they'd never see him again. Who would do that?" Another pause. Then someone who loved him more than life itself. Someone who would rather see him dead than with someone else. The therapist's next question was barely audible. "Courtney, are you talking about yourself?" The recording cuts off there. It was leaked by a receptionist at the therapy office, who was later sued into oblivion. But those final moments, that final question hanging in the air, have haunted everyone who's heard them. The revelation. But here's the part of the story that nobody knows, the part that wasn't in the leaked therapy session or the police reports or the thousands of articles written about Kurt's death. It comes from Frances Bean Cobain herself, in a letter she wrote to her mother on her 18th birthday but never sent. The letter was found by a journalist who was helping Frances organize her father's archives in Mom, the letter begins. I know what happened. I've always known. Not because anyone told me, but because I can feel it. The weight of it in every conversation we've never had, in every photo you can't look at, in every song of his you can't listen to. I know about the notes. All of them. I know about Mary Lou Lord. I know about the evidence Dad collected. I know about Rome. I know about April 6. But most of all, I know about the choice you made. The impossible choice between letting him leave with me or keeping him forever in the only way you could. I don't hate you for it. I understand that love can make us do incomprehensible things. But I need you to know that I know. And I need you to know that the truth isn't what destroyed our family. The lies are the truth. So what really happened between March 18th when Courtney tore up that first suicide note and April 8th when Kurt's body was found? The truth, as it always is messier than any conspiracy theory. Kurt did try to leave. The notes to Frances and Mary Lou Lord were real. The evidence he'd collected was real. His plan to take Frances and disappear was real. But so was his addiction. So was his depression. So was the unbearable weight of being Kurt Cobain. On April 5th, after sending that rose to Mary Lou Lord, Kurt went to the greenhouse above the garage. He brought his drug kit and the shotgun Dylan Carlson had bought him for protection. He wrote a note, the one we all know, that started as a retirement letter and ended as something else. But here's what the scene really tells us. Kurt was found with the shotgun in his mouth, but the drug kit unopened beside him. He'd been sober when he died. Stone cold sober. This wasn't the act of someone lost in a drug haze. This was a decision. Tom Grant, the private investigator Courtney hired to find Kurt, has always maintained that the scene was staged, but not in the way conspiracy theorists think. He believes Kurt staged it himself, deliberately leaving clues that would implicate Courtney, knowing that his death would destroy her in exactly the way she'd destroyed his plans to leave. It was the ultimate fuck you, Grant said in a 2021 interview. He knew the evidence he'd hidden would eventually come out. He knew the conspiracy theories would never stop. He knew she'd spend the rest of her life defending herself. It was psychological murder-suicide. The aftermath. Courtney found out Kurt was dead while she was still in Los Angeles. The official story is that she was informed by the Seattle police, but phone records show she called the house 17 times between April 6th and April 8th. She knew something. Maybe not that he was dead, but that something was terribly wrong. When she finally returned to Seattle, she did something that nobody understood at the time. She went straight to the greenhouse before the police had finished processing the scene, and she took something. Security footage from a neighbor's house shows her leaving with a small box, the same box marked Deimos that had contained Kurt's evidence against her. But Kurt had outsmarted her one last time. The box was empty, except for a single piece of paper with 2 words written in his handwriting. Check Rome. He'd hidden copies of everything in a safety deposit box in Rome, with instructions that it be opened in the event of his death. But when lawyers finally tracked down the box in 2001, it too was empty except for another note. Ask Frances. Frances turns 27 in August 2019. 2 months later, the therapy session leaked. Coincidence? Only Frances knows, and she's never spoken publicly about it. The final truth. The truth about Kurt Cobain's death isn't that he was murdered. It's that he was murdered slowly, over years, by fame, by drugs, by mental illness, and yes, by a toxic relationship that brought out the worst in both him and Courtney. The truth about that torn suicide note isn't that Courtney was trying to hide evidence. It's that she was trying to save him from himself, even if her methods were desperate and ultimately futile. The truth about their love wasn't that it was fake or calculated. It's that it was too real, too intense, too destructive. They were two damaged people who thought they could save each other, but ended up dragging each other into the abyss. When Courtney tore up that first suicide note on March 18, 1994, she thought she was preventing Kurt's death. In reality, she may have simply delayed it by 3 weeks. Or maybe, just maybe, she gave him 3 more weeks to change his mind, 3 more weeks with Francis, 3 more weeks to find a different way out. We'll never know what would have happened if she hadn't torn up that note. Would Kurt have gone through with it that night? Would the intervention have worked differently? Would he have actually left with Francis and started over? All we know is that when Courtney stood in their bedroom that night, holding the fragments of Kurt's pain in her hands, she made a choice. Not the right choice, or the wrong choice. Just a choice. The kind of choice that love forces us to make when there are no good options left. And maybe that's the real tragedy of Kurt and Courtney. Not that he died or that she survived, but that their love story became a cautionary tale, instead of what it could have been, a story of two misfits who found each other in the chaos and held on tight, even when holding on meant mutual destruction. The torn pieces of that suicide note were never found. Courtney claims she burned them, but sometimes, in interviews, when she's asked about Kurt, she touches her chest, right over her heart, as if checking that something is still there, as if those pieces of paper are hidden beneath her skin, a constant reminder of the night she tried to save the man she loved by destroying his words. And maybe, in the end, that's all any of us can do when faced with losing someone we love: tear up their goodbye and hope that without the words, they won't be able to leave. But Kurt found other words, and on April 5, 1994, in a greenhouse above a garage in Seattle, those words finally set him free. Or destroyed him. Or both. Just like he predicted the night he met Courtney Love.